7:10 in the morning. The Baltic Sea. Two F-18 Super Hornets were already crossing the Lithuanian coastline at Mach 1.2. This was not a routine freedom of navigation flight. For the first time in 30 years, the pilots carried live ordnance with pre-delegated weapons release authority. The question that would later consume every intelligence analyst in Washington and Moscow was not why the mission began, but what force chose to end it. The morning sun hung low over the horizon, turning the surface of the Baltic into a sheet of hammered lead. The air at 24,000 feet was thin and freezing. Below the lead aircraft, the coastline was a jagged line of dark green and gray. Commander Elias Thorne, callsign Raven 1, adjusted his oxygen mask. He could feel the weight of the two AGM-88 missiles hanging beneath his wings. They were designed to find and destroy radar sites. Today, they were aimed at the heart of the most defended territory in Europe. This was the culmination of 3 weeks of escalating tension. The Russian Federation had declared a total blockade of the Baltic states, citing security concerns in the Kaliningrad exclave. In response, the United States had moved a carrier strike group into the regional waters. The orders coming from the White House were clear. If the Russian radar systems locked onto any Allied aircraft, those systems were to be neutralized immediately. Inside the cockpit, the tactical situation display was a web of shifting symbols. A series of red circles indicated the reach of the Russian S-400 missile batteries. Commander Thorne watched as the edge of his icon touched the first circle. The electronic warfare suite began to chirp. It was a low, steady sound that indicated a search radar had found him. Commander Thorne spoke into the radio. Raven 2. This is lead. Confirm your master arm is on. Lieutenant Sarah Miller responded from the cockpit of the second fighter. Raven 1. This is 2. Master arm is on. I have a solid track on the primary emitter. Copy. We are 2 minutes from the release window. Stay on my wing. Behind them, 60 miles to the west, the USS Gerald R. Ford cut through the swell. In the Combat Information Center, the blue-lit room was filled with the hum of high-powered computers. The Admiral stood behind the radar operators, his eyes fixed on the long-range sweep. He knew that the moment Thorne fired, there would be no going back. The satellites were already positioned. The world was watching through 1,000 digital eyes. The air over the exclave was silent, but it was crowded. Russian Su-35 fighters were already climbing out of Chokhalovsk Air Base, their pilots pushing their engines to the limit. They were moving to intercept the Americans before they could reach their launch points. Commander Thorne looked at the digital readout. The distance was closing. His thumb rested on the red button on his control stick. He felt the cold sweat on the back of his neck. This was the edge of the world. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 7:12 in the morning. Chokhalovsk Air Base, Kaliningrad. Two Su-35 interceptors roared down the runway. Major Yuri Volkov felt the G-force press him into his seat as the aircraft left the ground. This was not a training exercise. The hangar doors had barely opened before the engines were at full afterburner. The Russian pilots had been on high alert for 72 hours. Now, the scramble order was real. Volkov spoke into his radio. Control. Falcon 1 is airborne. Requesting target vector. The controller responded immediately. Falcon 1. Vector is 030. Distance 60 kilometers. Altitude 7,000 meters. Two American F-18s are on an attack profile toward the exclave. You are authorized to use all necessary means to prevent a violation of the border. Understood. Volkov said. I am engaging combat radar. Falcon 2. Stay in trail. 7:13 in the morning. Inside the Russian cockpit, the digital display glowed with tactical data. The electronic warfare suite began to cycle through frequencies. Volkov watched as a green line spiked on his monitor. It was the signature of an American radar system. It was searching for his position. He adjusted his headset. The sound of the jamming signal was a low-frequency hum in his ears. Both sides were now painting the sky with high-energy waves. They were trying to blind each other. It was a silent battle of mathematics and physics, occurring miles above the water. 7:15 in the morning. In the lead American fighter, Commander Thorne saw the red diamond icon stabilize on his display. The Russian fighters were no longer just shadows on the edge of the screen. They were targets. The distance was closing with terrifying speed. He spoke to his wingman. Raven 2. Bogies are at 40 miles and closing. Bearing 090. They are coming in hot. Copy. Lead. Miller responded. Her voice was professional. Controlled. I have a track. They are at 20,000 feet and accelerating. They are moving into a bracket formation. Suddenly, a new sound erupted in Thorne's ears. It was a series of rapid, rhythmic chirps. The radar warning receiver showed a new threat. A ground-based S-400 system in Kaliningrad had just locked onto his aircraft. The system was powerful enough to track a target, the size of a bird from hundreds of miles away. Now, it was focused entirely on him. 7:16 in the morning. The radio on the International Guard frequency came to life. The voice was calm but firm. It was Major Volkov. American aircraft. You are approaching the Russian Federation security zone. Turn back to the west now. If you continue your current heading, we will take defensive action. Thorne did not flinch. He looked at his weapons display. The seeker heads on his missiles were already searching for the source of the radar lock. He could see the Russian fighters out of his side canopy now. 2 silver specks against the blue. He keyed his radio. Falcon 1. This is Raven 1. We are in international airspace. We are not a threat. We will continue our mission. Raven 1, Volkov replied. This is your final warning. Turn away. The Russian fighters leveled off at 24,000 feet. They were exactly matching the American altitude. They were now 30 miles apart. They were closing at a combined speed of over 2,000 miles per hour. On the ground in Kaliningrad, the missile crews watched their screens. The digital countdown for a launch solution reached 0. The commander of the battery looked at the flashing light on his console. He reached for the authorization key. The sky was bright and clear. It was a perfect day for a disaster. 7:18 in the morning. Over the Baltic Sea. The distance between the two formations was now less than 20 nautical miles. At their combined closing speed, they would pass each other in less than 30 seconds. Commander Thorne could see the distinct twin-tail silhouette of the Russian Su-35s against the morning haze. They were not flying a standard intercept pattern. They were aggressive. They were banking hard, trying to get behind the Americans. Raven 2. Break left. Now, Thorne commanded. Lieutenant Miller pulled her stick to the side. Her fighter rolled nearly 90 degrees. The G-force pushed her into the seat, making her breath come in short, sharp gasps. Copy, lead.
Keep looking, he's at your
Breaking left. I have the trailing bogey in my sights. He is trying to hook around. Guardian 1 to Raven flight. A new voice crackled over the secure frequency. It was the E-3 Sentry, the airborne early warning and control aircraft circling 100 miles to the south. Be advised. We are detecting additional launches from Chkalovsk. Or more contacts. High speed. They are at 10,000 feet and climbing. You are about to be outnumbered. Thorne felt a cold knot in his stomach. This was the trap. The first 2 fighters were the bait. The rest were the hammer. 7:21 in the morning. The National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. The room was silent except for the low murmur of data analysts. On the main screen, the Baltic was a digital chessboard. The Secretary of Defense stood with his hands on the back of a chair. He watched the blue icons of Raven flight being surrounded by red triangles. Mr. Secretary, a general whispered. The Russians have activated their long-range systems. They are not just defending the exclave. They are painting our tanker and the sentry. This is a coordinated strike profile. Do we have a link to the Kremlin? The secretary asked. The line is open, sir. But they are not talking. They claim their pilots are acting under standing orders to defend their sovereign territory. They are refusing to stand down. The secretary looked at the clock. The president has given Thorne the authority. If he feels his flight is in terminal danger, he can fire. We cannot stop him from here. 7:23 in the morning. Inside the Russian-led cockpit, Major Volkov was breathing heavily. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He was pulling 6 Gs as he spiraled upward, trying to keep the American commander in his radar cone. His screen was a mess of interference. The American electronic warfare was powerful. It was like trying to see through a blizzard of digital noise. Falcon 2. Close the gap, Volkov ordered. Do not let them get a lock. If they cross the 10-mile line, we engage. Major, his wingman replied, my systems are spiking. I am getting a missile launch warning. But there is no missile. It is a ghost. Ignore it, Volkov snapped. It is their jamming. Stay on target. The 2 groups of aircraft were now a tangled mess of steel and fire control radar. They were no longer flying paths. They were fighting for inches of sky. Every pilot had their hand on the stick and their finger on the trigger. The margin for error had vanished. The air was thick with the energy of 100 different sensors. It was the sound of a storm before the lightning. 7:24 in the morning, over the Baltic Sea. The cockpit of the lead American fighter was no longer a place of controlled observation. It was a chamber of electronic screaming. The radar warning receiver had shifted from a rhythmic chirp to a continuous, high-pitched wail. This was the sound of a terminal lock. On the ground near the city of Baltic, a foreign military long-range missile battery had transitioned from tracking to targeting. The system was now feeding a firing solution to 4 interceptor missiles. Commander Thorne felt the adrenaline surge through his system. His heart hammered against his ribs. He spoke into his mask, his voice tight but professional. Guardian 1. Raven 1. I have a terminal lock. S-400. Site 3. Requesting updated ROE. The response from the Sentry aircraft was immediate. Raven 1. This is Guardian 1. Your request is acknowledged. Washington has authorized. Rules of engagement are now self-defense. You are cleared to neutralize any platform showing hostile intent. Repeat. You are clear hot for self-defense. Thorne gripped the stick tighter. Raven 2. Did you copy? We are clear hot, Lieutenant Miller responded. Copy, lead. Clear hot. I am slaving my sensors to the S-400 emitter. I have a tone. I am ready to fire. 7:25 in the morning. Inside the foreign military long-range missile battery command van, the atmosphere was frozen. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled air. A young technician stared at the green phosphorus screen. The 2 American icons were flashing. They were now within the high-probability kill zone. The technician turned to his commander. Sir, the Americans are maneuvering. They are nose-on to our position. Their electronic warfare is peaking. They are preparing to launch. The foreign military commander hesitated. He knew that if he fired, the war began. But if he did not fire, his battery would be destroyed in seconds by the military aircraft anti-radiation missiles. He looked at the red authorization button. The weight of the moment was physical. Maintain the lock, he ordered. If they launch, we fire everything. Do not give them a second chance. 7:26 in the morning. Major Volkov watched the scene unfold from 5 miles away. His own radar showed the American fighters turning toward the coastline. They were no longer running, they were hunting. He saw the distinctive bloom on his display that indicated the Americans had opened their internal weapons bays or activated their missile seekers. Volkov spoke to his wingman, Falcon 2. The Americans are committed. We are moving to intercept. Target the lead fighter. Do not wait for my command if they fire. Defend the motherland. Copy. Falcon 1, the wingman replied. I am in position. Weapons are live. In the American cockpit, Thorne looked at his tactical map. The red lines of the Russian missiles and the blue lines of his own flight were about to cross. It was a geometric certainty. In less than 60 seconds, the sky would be filled with fire. He adjusted his grip on the stick. His thumb moved the safety cover off the launch button. He could feel the vibration of the engines through his boots. He was no longer a pilot. He was a component in a global machine that was about to break. The air was empty, yet it felt heavy. The silence of the radio was more terrifying than the noise of the alarms. 7:26 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The room was a cavern of blue light and muffled whispers. The admiral stood at the center of the command bridge. His eyes were fixed on the master tactical display. Around him, 40 specialists sat at their stations. They were the nerve center of the most powerful carrier strike group on the planet. Every sensor from the Baltic to the North Sea was feeding data into this room. The blue icons of the American Air Wing were now surrounded by a swarm of red. The weapons officer looked up from his console. His voice was flat. "Admiral, Raven flight is within the engagement envelope of the S-400 battery at Baltisk. We have confirmed multiple fire control locks. The Russian Su-35s are 5 miles out. They are in a firing solution for their short-range missiles." The admiral did not look away from the screen. Status of the rest of the wing. 24 aircraft are currently in the air. All pilots have confirmed the shift in rules of engagement. They have their hands on the weapons release. They are waiting for the final mark. 7:27 in the morning. Inside his cockpit, Commander Thorne felt the weight of the moment. The cockpit was filled with the smell of recycled oxygen and the faint scent of electrical heat. He adjusted his grip on the flight stick. His knuckles were white. He looked at his heads-up display. The computer was calculating the time to impact if he launched now. 12 seconds. In 12 seconds, his missiles would hit the radar site. In 15 seconds, the Russian interceptors would hit him. Raven 2, if I go, you go, Thorne said. Target the trailing fighter first. Do not let them get behind the tanker. Understood, Led, Miller replied. I am locked. My finger is on the trigger. Just give the word. 7:27 and 30 seconds in the morning. 5 miles away, Major Volkov felt a similar pressure. His finger was hovering over the launch button for his R-73 missiles. He could see the American fighter clearly now. It was a beautiful machine. He did not want to destroy it, but he had his orders. The safety on his weapon system was off. The infrared seeker in the nose of his missile was screaming in his headset. It had found the heat of the American engines. Falcon 2. On my mark, Volkov commanded. 1 missile each. We break high and left immediately after release. Do not wait to see the impact. Across the entire Baltic theater, 24 American pilots and 18 Russian pilots were at the absolute limit of human performance. They were not thinking about politics. They were thinking about the geometry of the kill. They were thinking about the split-second timing required to fire and survive. The electronic warfare systems of both nations were roaring at maximum power. The air was saturated with enough microwave energy to ignite a fire. Inside the Russian ground command van, the officer in charge took a final breath. He looked at the technician who held the firing key. For the motherland, he whispered. Execute! The technician turned the key. In the American cockpit, Thorne saw the launch warning flash from yellow to a pulsing, violent red. The ground battery had fired. He could see the plumes of white smoke rising from the coastline of Kaliningrad. The missiles were in the air. Raven flight. Break, break, break. Engaging now. Thorne squeezed the trigger. The 2 missiles under his wings detached with a heavy clunk. The rocket motors ignited. The aircraft lightened as they accelerated away. He watched the streaks of fire head toward the horizon. The war had begun. 7:27 and 10 seconds in the morning. Over the Baltic Sea. The sky was no longer blue. It was a grid of white smoke and jagged fire. 4 Russian surface-to-air missiles were climbing from the coast. 2 American missiles were diving toward the radar site. They were moving at 3 times the speed of sound. Commander Thorne pulled his stick. Hard. Right. The G-force hit him like a physical hammer. It was 9 times his body weight. His vision began to tunnel. Dark shadows crept in from the edges of his sight. This was the G-lock threshold. His flight suit inflated with a sharp hiss. It squeezed his legs to keep the blood in his brain. He could not breathe. He could only react. He shouted into his oxygen mask. Raven. 2. Deploy flares. Break floor. Now. Deploying? Miller gasped. Her voice was thin, strained. I have no room. They are on me. I cannot shake the lock. 7:27 and 30 seconds in the morning. Major Volkov watched his tactical display. His radar showed the American missiles. They were seconds from the coastline. The S-400 battery was about to be obliterated, but his own missiles were closing on the F-18s. The geometry of death was perfect. Falcon 2. Full power, Volkov commanded. Finish it. Do not let them escape. The Russian pilot pushed his throttles into the wall. The afterburners ignited. Two massive plumes of blue flame pushed his fighter forward. He was hunting. He saw the American lead aircraft roll. It was a desperate maneuver. Thorn was throwing everything at the sky to break the tracking of the radar. 7, 27, and 45 seconds in the morning. On the USS Gerald R. Ford, the silence was absolute. The Admiral stood frozen. The blue and red icons on the main screen touched. They merged into a single pulsing mass of data. The weapons officer gripped his console. His voice was a jagged edge. Impact in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. Inside Thorn's cockpit, the world was screaming. The radar warning receiver was a continuous, piercing tone. It was the sound of a missile that had found its home. Thorn saw the streak of the Russian interceptor in his peripheral vision. It was a white needle against the haze. He gripped the ejection handle. He prepared to pull. He looked at the photo of his family tucked into the corner of the instrument panel. The world seemed to slow down. The roar of the engines faded. The vibration of the airframe reached a crescendo. 7, 27, and 50 seconds in the morning. Thorn saw the flash in his mirror. The ground at Baltic exploded. A massive plume of black smoke and orange fire rose from the radar site. His missiles had hit. The S-400 battery was gone, but the Russian missiles were still coming. They were less than 500 meters away. They were too close to miss. Thorn braced for the impact. He felt the heat of the approaching warheads. He saw the seeker heads of the Russian missiles glowing like angry red eyes. In the Russian cockpit, Volkov had his finger on the secondary launch button. He was ready to fire his short-range missiles to ensure the kill. He saw the American fighter in his HUD. It was a perfect lock. The diamond was steady. "Goodbye, Raven," Volkov whispered. The air between them was saturated with energy. The sensors of 40 different aircraft were all locked on the same point in space. The computers were processing billions of bits of data every second. The world was one heartbeat away from a total nuclear exchange. 7:28 in the morning. Over the Baltic Sea. Commander Thorn closed his eyes. He waited for the Russian missile to tear through his cockpit. He waited for the fire, but the air around his fighter suddenly felt heavy. The screaming of the radar warning receiver did not stop. It changed. The high-pitched wail vanished. In its place was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through his teeth. He opened his eyes. The world had gone white. It was not the white of a cloud. It was the white of a dead television screen. Every digital display in the cockpit of his Super Hornet was glowing with a flat, blinding light. The tactical map was gone. The altitude indicator was gone. The weapon status was gone. In the center of his primary flight display, a single word appeared in stark black letters. AC-7, 7:28 and 10 seconds in the morning. Inside the Russian Su-35, Major Volkov stared at the same sight. His finger was still on the launch button. He squeezed it. Nothing happened. The missile remained on the rail. His flight controls felt like they were set in concrete. The aircraft was no longer responding to his touch. It was flying itself. It leveled off at 24,000 feet and began a wide, gentle turn back toward the mainland. Falcon 2. Report, Volkov said into his radio. There was no static. There was no interference. There was only the hum. He looked at his wingman. The other Russian fighter was also leveling off. It was moving in perfect synchronization with his own. Both aircraft were being piloted by something that was not human. 7:28 and 30 seconds in the morning. In the Combat Information Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Admiral stood in total darkness. Every screen in the room had flickered and died. The hundreds of millions of dollars of computer hardware were suddenly silent. The only light came from the emergency red lanterns on the bulkheads. The weapons officer tried to type on his keyboard. "Admiral, the system is locked. I have no control over the Aegis system. I have no control over the air wing." "The word?" the Admiral whispered. He was looking at the master display. The word "cease" was burned into the center of the screen. It was not a graphic. It was as if the pixels themselves had been rewritten. 7:29 in the morning. At the Pentagon, the situation was the same. The global satellite feed from the Baltic had cut to black. The Secretary of Defense picked up the secure phone to the White House. The line was dead. Every computer in the National Military Command Center showed the same single word. Reports began to flood in from across the world. It was not just the Baltic. It was the South China Sea. It was the border between India and Pakistan. It was every active combat zone on Earth. Every weapon system on the planet had been disabled simultaneously. 7:29 and 45 seconds in the morning. Commander Thorne felt his fighter begin to descend. The throttles moved on their own, pulling back to an idle setting. The canopy glass began to frost over from the outside. He looked out at the Russian fighter. Major Volkov was looking back at him. Both men had their hands in the air, away from the controls. They were passengers in their own war machines. The Russian missiles that had been inches from Thorne's tail were gone. They had not exploded. They had simply vanished from the sky. The smoke trails from the S-400 battery on the ground were dissipating into a perfectly clear blue sky. The silence was the most terrifying thing Thorne had ever heard. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a superior power. He tried to key his radio one last time. "Raven, 2. Sarah, do you see it?" There was no voice, only the hum. Then, a new sound began to bleed into his headset. It was a rhythmic pulse. It sounded like a heartbeat. It was slow, measured. It was the sound of something waiting. The morning sun continued to rise. The Baltic Sea was calm, but the world as they knew it had ended. 7:30 in the morning. Over the Baltic Sea, Commander Thorne felt a strange sensation in his hands. It was a faint vibration. It was not the vibration of the engines. It was the vibration of the control stick moving under its own power. He was no longer flying the F-18. The aircraft was flying him. He watched as the nose of his fighter dipped. It was a controlled descent. He was being guided away from the Russian border. He tried to override the system. He pulled the stick back. It was locked. He tried to toggle the manual flight controls. There was no response. The digital screens remained white. The word "seize" pulsed slowly. It was like a breathing heart. Thorne looked to his left. Lieutenant Miller was in the same position. Her hands were off the controls. She was looking at him. Her face was pale. She pointed at her own cockpit displays. They were identical to his. 7:32 in the morning. Inside the Russian interceptor, Major Volkov was experiencing the same phenomenon. His Su-35 was banked in a perfect 30-degree turn. It was heading back toward Shkalovsk Air Base. He checked his backup analog instruments. The fuel gauge was working. The airspeed indicator was working. But the fly-by-wire system was completely hijacked. He spoke into the internal cockpit recorder. "This is Major Volkov. My aircraft is under external control. I am unable to change heading or altitude. The weapon systems are inert. All digital interfaces are non-responsive. The intruder has total access to the flight computer." He looked at the American fighters. They were no longer targets. They were fellow prisoners. The aggression of the last 10 minutes had vanished. 7:35 in the morning. The National Security Agency at Fort Meade. The room was a hive of chaotic activity. Hundreds of analysts were staring at dead monitors. The lead cyber warfare officer stood at a central desk. He was shouting into a headset, "I want a trace on that signal. Now, I do not care if the satellites are down. Use the landlines. Use the undersea cables." An analyst looked up. Her eyes were wide with shock. "Sir, it is not a hack. We are monitoring the global internet backbone. The word is everywhere. It is on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It is on the billboards in Times Square. It is on every mobile phone in Moscow and Beijing." The officer froze. "What word?" "The same word. Sir. CEACE. It did not come through a server. It appeared simultaneously in the hardware registers. of every microprocessor on the planet. It is as if the silicon itself was rewritten. 7:42 in the morning. The USS Gerald R. Ford. The admiral stood on the flight deck. He watched as the Super Hornets returned. They were landing in a perfect sequence. There were no deck officers signaling them. There were no landing lights. The aircraft simply touched down and taxied to their parking spots. The engines shut down at the exact same moment. Commander Thorne climbed out of his cockpit. His legs were shaking. He stood on the deck and looked at the sky. It was a deep, empty blue. There were no more contrails. There were no more missile tracks. He saw Lieutenant Miller jump down from her jet. She ran toward him. Elias. Did you see the word? I saw it, Thorne said. It was not just us. It was everyone. Who did it? She asked. Was it the Russians? Did they find a back door? Thorne shook his head. He looked at the horizon. No, the Russians are as scared as we are. Look at their base. Their radar is dead too. Nobody has this kind of power. A low-frequency sound began to roll across the ocean. It was not a thunderclap. It was a sustained, vibrating note. It felt like it was coming from the water and the sky. At the same time, the ocean surface began to ripple in perfect geometric patterns. 7:50 in the morning. The world was silent. The weapons were cold. But a new presence had arrived. It was not a nation. It was not an army. And it was not finished speaking. 8 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The flight deck was a scene of unnatural order. Usually, the recovery of a full air wing is a chaotic symphony of screaming engines and shouting crews. Today, there was only the wind. The 24 aircraft sat in perfect rows. Their engines had cooled with impossible speed. Commander Thorne stood by the nose gear of his F-18. He reached out and touched the fuselage. The metal was not hot. It was room temperature. It was as if the laws of thermodynamics had been paused, along with the war. He looked at the carrier's primary radar mast. The massive slab of the SPY-3 radar was motionless. It was not rotating. It was not emitting. Beside him, Lieutenant Miller was staring at her handheld tablet. Elias. Look at this, she said. She held up the device. The screen was not black. It showed a live feed of the Earth from a weather satellite. Across the entire northern hemisphere, the clouds were shifting. They were not moving with the wind. They were forming into perfect, concentric circles, centered over every major military installation on the planet. One circle was centered directly over their current position in the Baltic. Another was visible over Kaliningrad. It is a physical manifestation, Thorne whispered. Whatever is doing this, it is not just in the software. It is moving the atmosphere. 8:00 to 5 in the morning. Chkalovsk Air Base, Kaliningrad. Major Volkov climbed down the ladder of his Su-35. His ground crew did not move to meet him. They were standing in a circle around a mobile radar unit. The technician who had been prepared to fire the S-400 missiles was on his knees. He was staring at the ground. Volkov walked over to him. Report, why are you not securing the aircraft? The technician pointed at the concrete. A thin layer of frost was forming in the shape of the word cease. It was mid-July. The temperature was 22 degrees Celsius. Yet the ground was freezing, in the exact pattern of the message they had seen in their cockpits. Major, the technician said. His voice was trembling. It is in the soil. It is in the air. I tried to radio Moscow. The handset turned to ice in my hand. It is not a weapon. It is a command. Volkov looked up. High above the base, the silver circle of clouds was tightening. The sun was being eclipsed not by the moon, but by a perfect ring of vapor. The light on the ground turned a strange, bruised purple. 8:10 in the morning. The National Military Command Center. The Secretary of Defense sat in the dark. The emergency lights were the only thing keeping the room from total blackness. A courier ran into the room. He was carrying a physical piece of paper. In an age of instant digital communication, the world had been forced back to the 19th century. Sir, we have a report from the Strategic Command. The courier panted. The nuclear triad is offline. The silos in North Dakota, the submarines in the Pacific, The bombers in Missouri, all of them. Offline how? The secretary asked. Did the power go out? No, sir. The physical keys. The manual launch keys in the silos. They have fused into the locks. The crews cannot turn them. And the digital codes. Every launch computer in the world has been wiped. The hard drives are blank, except for one file. The secretary leaned forward. Let me guess. The word CEASE. Yes, sir. But there is more. The file size is 0. There is no data. The word is just there. Like a ghost in the machine. 8:15 in the morning. The low-frequency hum that had been vibrating through the world suddenly shifted pitch. It rose into a pure, crystal note. On the deck of the carrier, Thorne felt the hair on his arms stand up. The ocean around the ship began to glow with a soft, bioluminescent blue. It was not coming from the water. It was a reflection from the sky. A massive shadow began to pass over the Baltic. It was not a ship. It was not a plane. It was a distortion in the air itself. It was as if a giant lens was moving through the atmosphere, bending the light and the wind. As it passed over the Russian and American fleets, the tension that had been building for weeks simply evaporated. The pilots, the sailors, and the soldiers did not feel fear. They felt a profound, overwhelming sense of being watched. The intervention was complete. The crisis had been neutralized by a force that did not use fire. It used silence. The world was no longer in the hands of the generals. It had been taken back. 8:20 in the morning. The Baltic Sea. The pulsing blue light that had saturated the sky began to pull back. It did not fade like a sunset. It retracted upward like a curtain being drawn toward the stars. The heavy, pressurized feeling in the air vanished. In its place was a crisp, natural morning breeze. On the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the silence was finally broken by the sound of waves hitting the hull. Commander Thorne stood by the wing of his aircraft. He watched as the digital glass of the cockpit suddenly flickered. The white screens died. For 3 seconds, there was total darkness. Then, the systems began their boot sequence. The green glow of the flight computers returned. The tactical maps loaded. But something was different. He climbed back into the seat to look at the primary display. The radar was active, but the range was limited to 50 miles. The weapon status board was gray. Every missile icon was marked with a single black diagonal line. Thorne reached for the master arm switch. It would not move. He applied more pressure. It felt as if the toggle had been welded into the off position from the inside. He keyed his radio. Raven 2. This is Lead. Radio check. Lead. I hear you loud and clear, Miller responded. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the exhaustion behind it. Systems are back, but I am locked out of the fire control. The computer says the weapons are externally restricted. Copy. I have the same, Thorne said. Guardian 1. Do you have us? We have you, Raven Flight. The controller on the Sentry aircraft replied. Be advised. We are seeing the same across the entire theater. Radar is functional for navigation only. All combat systems are hard-locked. We are calling it a state of enforced neutrality. All units are ordered to return to base immediately. 8:25 in the morning. Chakalovsk Air Base. Major Volkov sat in his cockpit. He watched the same reboot process. His Su-35 was alive again, but it was no longer a weapon. It was just an airplane. He looked at the heads-up display. The Russian Cyrillic text was clear, but the targeting reticle was gone. In its place was a small, persistent icon. In the corner of the screen, he looked toward the American carrier group on his long-range camera. The ships were turning. They were no longer in an attack formation. They were moving west toward the open Atlantic. Volkov spoke into the radio, using the international frequency. Raven 1. This is Falcon 1. Do you receive? A pause lasted for 5 seconds. Then Thorne's voice came through. Falcon 1. I hear you. My engines are started. Volkov said. I am beginning my taxi. I am not a threat. My weapons are disabled. Understood, Falcon, Thorne replied. Mine are the same. We are heading home. Good luck, Major. Good luck, Commander. There was no victory in the voice of either man. There was only a profound, professional understanding. They had both been prepared to die for a cause that had been rendered irrelevant in a single second. 8:30 in the morning. The Pentagon. The lights were back on. The Secretary of Defense stood in front of the global map. The red triangles and blue circles were still there, but they were no longer flashing. The world was static. "Report," the Secretary said. "The Sea's message has moved to a background process," a general replied. "Our engineers say the hardware is untouched, but the firmware has been modified. It is a logic gate that we cannot bypass. If we try to arm a weapon, the system simply shuts down the power supply to that component. It is a perfect, non-destructive lock. And the Russians? Their embassy just sent a formal communiqué," the general said. It was a one-sentence document. It says, "We are experiencing the same restriction. We propose a temporary suspension of all hostilities until the source is identified." The secretary looked at the clock. It had been exactly 63 minutes since the first American pilots crossed the coastline. In 1 hour, the world had gone from the brink of nuclear war to a global ceasefire that no human had signed. "The crisis is over," the secretary said. He sat down and rubbed his eyes. But the mystery is just beginning. We were not saved by diplomacy. We were grounded. The Baltic was quiet. The ships moved. The planes flew. But for the first time in history, the soldiers were not the ones in control of the peace. 4 in the afternoon. 3 hours after the intervention, the USS Gerald R. Ford moved through the North Sea. The flight deck was quiet. The aircraft had been moved to the hangar bay for immediate inspection. Commander Thorne sat in a small, windowless debriefing room. A camera was mounted in the corner. Across the table sat 2 officers from Naval Intelligence and a civilian from the National Security Agency. "Commander," the civilian said, "tell us again about the moment of the freeze. Did you see a light? Did you hear a sound before the display changed?" Thorne leaned back. He was still wearing his flight suit. There was no light. There was a sound. A low hum. It felt like it was coming from the airframe itself. Not the electronics. The actual metal. And then the word appeared. "Cease," the officer noted. "Yes, it was not a message on the screen," Thorne explained. "It was as if the screen was not there. The word was just present. When I tried to override the flight computer, the stick felt like it was part of a statue. It did not move an inch. Then the aircraft flew itself back to the ship. We have confirmed the same from every pilot in the wing," the civilian said. He looked at a file. "And we have intercepted the Russian debriefings." Major Volkov reported the exact same experience. Their S-400 battery commander claims his firing key was physically fused into the console. He could not turn it back to the safe position until the blue light vanished. 24 hours later, Fort Meade, Maryland. The analysis of the intervention code was ongoing. The brightest minds in computer science and physics were gathered in a secure vault. They were looking at the core architecture of the microprocessors recovered from one of the Super Hornets. "It is not a virus," the lead scientist told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "A virus is data. This is a rearrangement of the atoms in the silicon. The hardware has been physically altered to create a logic gate that we did not build. It is a hard stop command. It recognizes the electrical signature of a weapon being armed. When that signature is detected, the gate closes. The weapon cannot fire." "Can we reverse it?" the chairman asked. "No, sir. We tried to replace the chip with a fresh one from the factory. The moment we plugged it into the jet, the new chip was modified. In less than a millisecond. Whatever did this is still here. It is monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum of the entire planet. It is an automated peacekeeper." 3 days later, Brussels, Belgium. The North Atlantic Council met in an emergency session. For the first time in history, a Russian delegation was present as observers. There was no shouting, there were no threats. The diplomats looked at each other with a mixture of relief and profound existential dread. The military analysis was clear. The world's primary weapon systems were now useless. The aircraft could fly, the ships could sail, the tanks could move, but they could not kill. The state of enforced neutrality was holding. We are calling it the Baltic Event. the Secretary General announced to the press. While we do not yet know the source of the intervention, the result is undeniable. The conflict in the Baltic has ended. The blockade of the exclave has been lifted by necessity. We are entering a period of global reassessment. In a quiet apartment in Moscow, Major Volkov sat by his window. He held a glass of water. He looked at the sky and wondered if the things that had stopped him were still up there. In Virginia, Commander Thorne sat on his porch and watched his children play in the yard. Both men knew the truth. They had been ready to end the world. Something else had decided that the world was worth saving. The strategic map of the Earth had been wiped clean. The old rules of power were gone. The era of the machine was over. The era of the observer had begun. 3 months passed. The world was quiet. The strategic map of the planet had been redrawn not by a treaty or a war, but by a universal technical failure. Military analysts in every capital city sat in rooms filled with paper maps and wooden blocks. Stripped of the digital tools that had once defined modern power, the hard stop logic gate remained active in every microprocessor on Earth. Any attempt to manufacture a new weapon resulted in the same physical modification of the silicon. The era of the automated kill was over. Strategic assessment, November 10th, Washington, D.C. The Secretary of Defense stood before a joint session of Congress. The room was illuminated by natural light. The digital projectors and massive screens were dark. They were no longer trusted. He held a leather-bound folder containing the final report on the Baltic Event. The conclusion of our scientific community is unanimous, the Secretary said, his voice echoing in the marble chamber. The intervention was not the work of a terrestrial power. The modification of the silicon and the atmospheric distortions recorded over the Baltic require a level of energy control that are 4 centuries beyond our current physics. We were not hacked, we were corrected. He turned a page. Our satellites have detected a series of gravitational anomalies in high Earth orbit. They are not objects, they are distortions in the fabric of space-time. They act as a monitoring network. Whenever a high-energy weapons system is activated, these anomalies respond with a localized electromagnetic pulse that rewrites the hardware of the offending platform. They are the origin of the word. They are the authors of the silence. A senator stood up. And the word itself? Cease? Have we found any other communication? No, the secretary replied. There has been no other message. There have been no demands. There has been no attempt to occupy or govern. It is a single, functional boundary. We are allowed to live. We are allowed to travel. We are allowed to thrive. But we are no longer allowed to destroy. In the months that followed, the global economy underwent a massive shift. The hundreds of billions of dollars that had been allocated for stealth fighters and hypersonic missiles were redirected toward infrastructure and energy. Without the threat of sudden kinetic strikes, the tension that had defined the 21st century began to dissolve. It was not because human nature had changed. It was because the tools of violence had been taken away. Inside a quiet hangar at Langley Air Force Base, Commander Elias Thorne stood under the wing of his Super Hornet. The aircraft was a museum piece now. It could fly, but its teeth had been pulled. He reached up and touched the underside of the wing where the missiles had once hung. The metal felt cool and inert. He thought about Major Volkov. He thought about the 63 minutes in the Baltic when they were both ready to fire. The shots that would have burned the world. He realized that they were the last of a species. They were the last combat pilots. Thorne looked up through the hangar doors at the afternoon sky. It was a deep, clear blue. There were no contrails. There were no radar sweeps. For the first time in his life, the sky felt like it belonged to the wind and the birds again. Experts would later agree that the Baltic Event saved the human race from itself. The mystery of who or what intervened remained the greatest question in history. But the answer was less important than the result. The single word that had appeared on every screen was not a threat. It was a gift of time. The most advanced weapons in the world had been stopped by something neither side could control. And whatever was watching was not finished. It was waiting to see what we would do with the peace we had been forced to accept. The morning was still. The world was still. For now, that was enough.